If you've ever been antique hunting, you have probably seen a crazy quilt, a wild amalgamation of fabrics accented by colorful embroidery. But where did they come from? How, in a craft that's best known for carefully planned out, precisely placed pieces, did quilts that can best be described as kaleidoscopes of organized chaos come to be such a popular trend? First, let's take a brief look at how quilting itself came to be. The art of quilting, that is, stitching together layers of fabric and padding, has been around in a variety of uses for a lot longer than you might think. Probably as long as people have lived. There was an ivory carving found in Abydos, Egypt of a pharaoh from the 35th century BC, roughly 5,500 years ago, who appears to be wearing a quilted cloak. The oldest surviving example of a decorative quilted piece was found in a cave in Mongolia, and archaeologists estimate its age to be somewhere between 100 BC and 200 AD. Quilting was also used in the 12th century by warriors as the protective garment we know as the gambeson, which later led to quilted doublets, which were popular until the mid-17th century, and by women for warm quilted petticoats, which we see frequently in the 18th and 19th centuries. The oldest bed quilt that has survived is the Tristan quilt, which was made in the late half of the 14th century using linen and wool, and through decorative backstitches tells the story of Tristan and Isolde. Through the 16th and 17th centuries, quilts tended to be whole cloth, made from strips of the same fabric to make a covering big enough to fit a bed. The concept of patchwork quilting, at least in America, seems to have begun in the mid-1770s and grew in popularity through the late 1800s, early 1900s. But while we have all these set, precise quilting patterns throughout history, the iconic crazy quilt follows no definite pattern. So how, when, and why did it become so popular? No one knows exactly who made the very first crazy quilt, but we do know that it was a trend that started in the early 1880s. They're most commonly believed to have been inspired by, or at least heavily influenced by, Japanese art that was on display at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition in 1876. This was a huge expo with nearly 10 million visitors attending, and people got to see many things that were new and novel, including inventions like the telephone, foods like popcorn and Heinz ketchup, and artwork from countries like Japan. You see, trade with Japan had only just opened up to America, so most people were seeing the Japanese style of artwork and textiles for the very first time. The asymmetrical styles, crackle-glazed pottery, and naturalistic designs were intriguing to the Victorians, who, let's be honest, had a fascination and love of the exotic and oriental. The other display that played a role in the crazy quilt design was from the Royal School of Art Needlework in the British Pavilion, which featured the decorative British art needlework. The combination of new exotic art styles and decorative embroidery came together to create a super fad among Victorian homemakers. Another factor in the rise of the crazy quilt fad, and it was a fad, was the newfound access to a wider variety of fabrics. The textile industry had just come from the boom of the Industrial Revolution, which meant that fabrics like silk, which previously had to be imported at great cost, were now available for a much more reasonable price. Meaning that silk, which previously was reserved for the fanciest of dresses and occasions, was now more accessible for everyday wear. And anyone who sews knows, the more you sew, the more scraps you have. And once the crazy quilt fad caught on, some dressmakers started selling bags of variegated silk scraps to these eager quilters. In fact, there was a poem from 1884 entitled The Crazy Quilt, which read, "Shaking heads and looking wise, merchants smile with doubtful eyes. When expectant of a prize, maidens beg a sample. Stocks of velvet, silk, or frieze, like the famous nibbled cheese, disappears if dames to please, clipped are fragments ample." Sewing machines were also now affordable for the common household, and upper-class women were encouraged to try fancy work, which is the Victorian name for interior decorating. And if you've ever looked at photographs of Victorian homes, you'll know they loved their decor. Minimalists, they were not. The crazy quilt fad also coincided with the era known as the aesthetic movement, which was a recognition of the necessity of beautiful things in everyday life. There was a push to make beautiful art simply because the art was beautiful, and to fill your home with beautiful things that, shall we say, spark joy. In Oscar Wilde's essay, The Home Beautiful, he mentions, "Today more than ever, the artist and the love of the beautiful are needed to temper and counteract the sordid materialism of the age." A sentiment just as true in 2024 as it was in 1882, if not more so. And in fact, the initial crazy quilts were not the cozy bed coverings that we normally associate with quilts, but rather decorative pieces designed to show off women's skill at embroidery. They were more commonly kept in the parlor to be seen and admired by visitors, and referred to as slumber robes or couch throws. And since they were supposed to be more fashionable than functional, they often left out the internal batting that you see in other quilt styles. This did change toward the end of the fad when crazy quilts started becoming more everyday and, dare I say, utilitarian. The later you get in the trend, the more you'll see a shift in the fabric choices, switching to varieties of cotton and wool with only a small amount of silks and velvets, as opposed to the early crazy quilts, which were mostly made of silks and velvets, but could include any variety of fabrics of choice, and some creative quilters branched out to include souvenir ribbons from places like state fairs and sporting events. It was also an excellent opportunity to include the memory of one close to you or recently departed. There are instances of crazy quilts made from scraps of loved ones' gowns or suits, laces, and trims, not dissimilar from the t-shirt memory quilts of today. But while women were having a grand old time with their newfound hobby, not everyone was happy with the trend. There came a point where some men were concerned that so much time spent on fancy work was unhealthy and that their time could be spent in more productive ways. There was an article in Harper's Bazaar from September 13, 1884, entitled Crazy Work and Sane Work, which I won't read the full article, but the link is in the description for anyone who wants to have a wry chuckle. The highlights are as follows. It starts with mentioning a crazy quilt being raffled off that was made from 9,000 scraps of fabric that took approximately 1,500 hours to complete. The author remarks, "To the maker and her friends it appeared a monumental labor of taste, industry, and artistic talent. To us it stood for a misdirected energy and perseverance too common among women. What might not this industrious young woman have accomplished in that time? Their countless stitches and ugly ingenuity appear to them the fit expression of aesthetic instincts, and they give thanks that they live in the cultivated age which ornaments its whisk-broom holders. Raphael and Leonardo would never have thought of that. And most women need to be reminded that the time they daily industriously waste would do for them what it does for men: conquer new worlds." The shade. But though shade was thrown, the crazy quilt trend continued firmly until the mid-19-teens. There doesn't appear to be one decisive reason for why crazy quilts became less popular, so the closest theory would be it was a trend, and trends come and go. In the same way that fashion and decor falls in and out of style and then resurfaces 20 to 30 years later, previous quilting patterns started coming back into style. And while there were still some who kept on crazy quilting, there was a shift to make them more everyday and practical instead of the silk-heavy, ornate decorations of the previous decades. And we do still see the iconic crazy quilt style pop up every now and then. It made a resurgence in the 60s and 70s, and I would almost say that we're seeing it pop up again now with the boho fashion movement and a renewed interest in vintage and antiques, as seen in these jackets from Anthropologie and Cézanne. And while the trend of making crazy quilts may not be the rage that it once was, we are still very fortunate to have hundreds of surviving quilts around to this day, including this dear one from 1914. This is one that my mum found at a thrift store a number of years ago, and it has been well loved ever since. Now, what spurred this sudden rabbit hole into crazy quilt research? Well, to put it simply, I'm making one. And I wanted to make it with as much historical practice or as accurately to the era as possible. And so I combed through museum files and took a good hard look at this old lady. Because one thing that intrigued me during my research was the construction method for crazy quilts. You see, traditional quilts follow the same construction steps regardless of pattern. Cut your small uniform pieces, stitch together your little pieces, press the seams, join more pieces, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat until you have a quilt block. Join your blocks together and Bob's your uncle, you have a quilt top. Then you make a sandwich with the quilt top, batting, and backing and secure everything in place with decorative stitching. However, as I looked into crazy quilts, I realized the construction method is quite different. This is partially because crazy quilts were originally designed as decorative pieces, so they didn't have to be warm and cozy, but also because you're using non-uniform pieces of fabric. Thankfully, the Sidley quilt, as we call it in the Halfling house, gives us a lot of insight into the construction. Being from 1914, it's a bit more of the everyday fabric style than a full-blown Victorian quilt would have been, but the construction methods are still the same. It is in fairly good shape considering that it is literally 110 years old. However, time is doing what time does to natural fibers, and there are pieces that have started to shred. This is sad to see it gradually deteriorate, but today it is fortunate for us, for it gives us the unique opportunity to very carefully peek behind the seams. If we look under here, this is this piece, and they didn't fold it under, they just left this piece sitting flat and then folded the blue fabric over top. It's hard to tell, it almost looks like it was whip stitched into place along there and then tacked in place with the embroidery. And then this side, very carefully. So this piece there, again, just left raw, didn't fold it under or anything, just left it sitting flat. I can't tell how the blue was stitched down on this side, but it's held in place also by the embroidery. And now some of them, if you look really closely, you can see the edges were turned under and they were basted down with running stitches. You can just see them there. Come over to a piece like this though, and you'll see it was folded under and whip stitched down with those little bitty whip stitches. Here again, we see it was turned under and running stitched into place. One thing I love, you can tell how different the selvages used to be compared to modern selvage edges, because this is a selvage edge. They didn't even bother turning it under, they just laid it flat and running stitched it down. Just like that, no fraying. Got a little bit of piecing here, as they say piecing is period. Here's another selvage edge, another good example. This selvage edge is totally raw and then just whip stitched down. Nothing fancy, totally visible. And then the embroidery covers most of it. And this is a good example of the chaos. The brown fabric was folded over the gray, but the gray was folded over top of the black and the green fabric. And here we have what's probably a little mended spot. You can see some contrasting thread underneath and then some decorative stitching over top. Somebody definitely mended this edge here with a very rough whip stitch. Lots of selvage edges. You've got selvage edge there, you've got selvage edge here. Although this one they did turn under. And this piece here is fascinating because it looks like, from what I can tell, these two were running stitched together, but they're not stitched down to the base fabric. These seams are floating, but secured in place with the embroidery. It took me 10 years of owning this quilt to notice that the center was a square and that the crazy pattern radiated outward from there. The circular embroidery would have been going all the way around originally. And in this little square here, we have a little bit of piecing. And they didn't even make sure the stripes were going the same direction. They just made sure it's a proper little triangle. So yes, piecing is period. I love what a mix of construction stitches we have. You've got whip stitches there, very obvious little running stitches, more whip stitches. So lessons in imperfection. More whip stitches there, and running and whip stitches on this same piece of fabric. And more selvage edges just left raw, not even worrying about turning it under. This one they turned under, but this one, just the selvage, right there. Some lovely velvet selvage right along there. Very beautiful. I love this texture. Historical velvet and the velvet corduroy. So nice. And fascinating thing, if we come over to this corner, it's only in this corner, but there is finer herringbone stitching along some of the edges. You can see it along these pieces, and then they were covered up by the yarn that was used for the rest of the quilt. I have no idea why they started with the thinner thread and then switched to thicker for the rest. Maybe they ran out, maybe it was a pain to work with, I don't know. But it's such a neat little detail. Also, this fabric is an absolute delight. And then let's flip it over and have a quick look at the back. This is why we have to be careful because the underside is shredding much more than the top. You can just see through to the wrong side of the top here. So you have muslin backing and then the patchwork was stitched onto that muslin. But yes, we're going to be very careful and help this lovely lady last as long as she can. We can see a bit of the construction here. We do have nice poofy batting, which was not initially part of Crazy Quilts, but became more common in the later, more practical end of the trend, like we've got here. It's hard to figure out how they did the edge. We've got a frilly edge here. As far as I can tell, they sewed the backing to the frill first, and then they turned under the patchwork top and felled it down by hand. When you look closely, you can see there's a lot of hand stitching around the edge. That may have just been mending, or it's entirely possible the entire thing was finished by hand. I found the process of looking really closely at a quilt I've owned for literally a decade to be fascinating, and it gives me an even deeper appreciation for it and the construction methods. I wager whoever this family was, they probably never imagined someone admiring their quilt over a century later. It also gives me a lot to go on as I construct my own Victorian-inspired crazy quilt, and I can't wait to show you the construction process. As this video is no doubt quite long already, I saved the making of it for my next video. So if you don't want to miss that, hit the subscribe button and the little bell icon to be notified when it comes out. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, and if you have any crazy quilt memories or stories, I would love to hear about them in the comments. And I will see you soon for more geekery meets history sewing adventures.